it's time for us to begin. Thank you for being here today. My name is Minerva. I'm the director of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies and also the co-director of PONAS Eurasia with my colleague Henry Hale, who is based in Moscow for the year, so he's not here with us today. And so we have launched this speaker series called New Voices on Russia already 2 years ago, with the goal of bringing a new generation of scholars working on Russia to the DC policy community, with this idea that we were tired of listening and hearing that there is no new generation of experts on Russia able to tell us what is happening in the country and abroad related to Russia, and that on the contrary, we wanted to show that there is a rich generation of scholars who are following what is happening in Russia and around Russia. And so the series has been running monthly since 2 years now, and we are very happy to receive for today's session Dr. Emily Holland, who is an assistant professor of political science at the United States Naval Academy, so she's not very far, she's based in Annapolis. She received her Ph.D. in political science from Columbia University, and she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Davis Center. She works on energy politics, Russian foreign policy, US-Russia relation, and European politics, and she has been widely published, but today she will be especially discussing what I think is really a very important growing topics, which is Russia's dominance on the global nuclear reactor market. So, Emily, thank you for being here, and give you the floor.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I just raced over from my last class for this semester of Russian foreign policy, so I'm in the mode to discuss Russia's latest adventures. So this talk is going to be focused on a little bit of an overview on sort of the state of affairs in terms of the global reactor market, but focus particularly on the Russia-China relationship as a part of that. I wrote a policy piece that should be maybe be accepted somewhere pretty soon on this particular topic. So, and it follows off my previous work, which was my dissertation, which is a forthcoming book of mine, which is on Russian foreign policy in Eastern Europe via Gazprom as an instrument of Russian foreign policy. So now I've kind of moved my work from Gazprom to Rosatom, and I'm hoping to do sort of similar work that I did with understanding Gazprom's motives in Europe to understanding sort of Rosatom's motives actually around a much wider geographical area. So earlier this year, Rosatom, which is Russia's state-owned nuclear power agency, they signed a deal with the Chinese National Nuclear Corporation to build 2 more reactors in China, and Xi Jinping and Putin were both present for this signing, which was actually just the most recent of a big package of civilian nuclear deals between the 2 states. And these 2 additional reactors are going to bring the total of kind of planned, under construction, and completed reactors, nuclear reactors in China, to a total of 12. And China is, probably unsurprisingly, one of Russia's best markets for nuclear reactors. But Moscow has actually begun construction on a long-planned nuclear reactor in Turkey recently, and has recently announced its intention to focus on Africa as a priority region for nuclear sales as well. And this sort of fits into a wider puzzle, which shows really that over the last decade, as Western companies have receded from the global nuclear reactor market, Rosatom in Russia has invested in both domestic and the foreign nuclear sector, quietly expanding the scope of its activities, so that now Rosatom actually controls over 67% of all global reactor sales. So they've basically effectively pushed the West entirely out of the global market. And so, as you can imagine, after signing several major contracts with China, as well as expanding the scope of its activities in India, the Middle East, South America, and now Africa, Western policymakers have just sort of begun to express a little bit of concern over the strategic implication of the Russian dominance of this sector. And moreover, kind of recent landmark nuclear deals between China and Russia are seen as evidence of a troubling Sino-Russian strategic alliance, and a recent piece in Foreign Affairs garners this quote here, which is basically saying the Kremlin appears to be pressing its formidable nuclear market power to influence and bind countries around the world to its irredentist and revanchist aims. Rosatom, for its part, argues, of course, that its motives are purely commercial. But should we be worried about Russia's prominent role in the global nuclear renaissance? An in-depth analysis of all of Rosatom's global projects actually, to me, reveals kind of a dual strategy. It's not as simple as it may appear. And so, of course, although the possibility of a Chinese-Russian partnership across a host of different issues could certainly be problematic for the West, in the civilian nuclear power arena, this actually should not be a place to be concerned. And to preview my argument, I'll be going into this in depth in a few minutes, is to understand the extent to which dependence fosters changes in the overall relationship, we need to not only examine who are Russia's important clients, but also how important Russia is as a producer in the downstream state, right? And this is really where the difference is. In the Chinese case, Russia is a very important provider, but it's not a crucial one. China does have some flexibility and alternatives. But by this standard, it also means that we should be actually quite a bit worried about Russia's activities in other markets, especially in places like Turkey, where Rosatom's activities may indeed be part of a sort of a wider Kremlin strategy to increase engagement and influence outside of the near abroad. So you probably have seen the news this week, right? That the much-lauded Power of Siberia started piping gas this week. This has been a very long-term project. But many of the claims that we see both about Power of Siberia and the nuclear sector are based off of a characterization of Russian energy diplomacy in the European context. And they don't really necessarily have the same comparable status as they do in these particular areas. So maybe we should not be so worried about both Power of Siberia and nuclear. And of course, the reason why people get so concerned about this is because it brings up images of Russia's dominance in the European sector. Of course, the famous gas cutoffs in Ukraine in 2006 and 2009, which were widely covered because they had sort of disastrous consequences for Eastern Europe at large. So just in terms of the Power of Siberia, as a little side note, of course it is important that Russia and China are having increased engagement over energy, but power in the Chinese market, Russia actually faces significant competition for its gas market. The reason why Russia has been so successful, or had been so successful up for many years, in sort of extracting and using its foreign policy, Gazprom as a foreign policy tool in Europe, was because it effectively had a monopoly, right? That is not the case in China. Gazprom has been very frustrated over the years with its negotiations with China on Power of Siberia. I was in several meetings with negotiators for Gazprom who were just kind of constantly voicing their frustrations at not being able to extract the same kind of leverage or not to achieve the same kind of goals that they had been hoping when Gazprom had turned their strategy towards China as a result of some market changes in Eastern Europe. So this, as we kind of know, the kind of basic story of Russia's use of energy was that, okay, Russia's dominance of the European gas market has been this major security concern. We have the gas cutoffs, and the Europeans, of course, had responded to this by pushing hard for the third energy package, which actually did reduce Gazprom's ability to sort of vertically integrate all of its strategy and sort of have Gazprom's strategy in general was to sort of buy up all of the infrastructure in sort of many downstream states, which it did very successfully. It bought Belarus's entire gas infrastructure project, which meant that Gazprom owns not only the pipeline going to Belarus, but also the pipeline going through Belarus and even the pipeline going to people's homes. That's called at-burner tip. So Gazprom owned literally all that infrastructure. And that had been sort of Gazprom's strategy throughout Eastern Europe, which obviously gave it quite a bit of power that it was able to move from beyond the energy sector to maybe different sectors of foreign policy. But a lot changed in the years of Gazprom's sort of gas renaissance. Oil prices dropped, liquefied natural gas became more commercially available, which the United States shale gas revolution completely changed the gas market. So now a lot of gas that was bound for the United States was no longer being sold in the U.S., so it was being sent to Europe instead. So this really did undercut a lot of Gazprom's ability to just turn a vast profit. And so Russia decided to try to diversify strategy. And one way that they did this, and very smartly in fact, was to emphasize the nuclear sector. So nuclear power is interesting. Most people think, well, why does it matter? Why do we care about nuclear, right? It's over, right? And sure, nuclear power as a share of electricity generation fell sharply after Fukushima, but had already been on the decline due to difficulty competing against natural gas and renewables. But the sector has actually recovered in recent years, with many actually embracing nuclear as a way to meet climate goals. And in fact, most sort of serious recommendations on how to kind of capping climate change have actually, you have to include nuclear sort of in that, in those plans. And the IE estimates that there will be 1.1 trillion in investment in nuclear by 2040, leading to an increase in nuclear power production of about 46%. But as you can see here, growth is very concentrated, right? So 93% of net production increases are accounted for by India and China. China has stated its plan to increase its nuclear capabilities vastly, not only within China domestically, but along the BRI. And China's announced its intention to become a net exporter in nuclear power plants. So it's importing Russian technology now, but it's announced its plan to get into the market in the future. So as the market changed and nuclear began this slow rebound, the West had also completely declined in the nuclear world. Western nuclear power companies face serious challenges. So Pittsburgh-based Westinghouse is probably the company that most Americans are most familiar with. Followed for Chapter 11 in 2017. It's since sort of emerged with some restructuring. Toshiba, Électricité de France have struggled to remain competitive on the global market for a number of reasons. Fears of sort of Western constituents, changes in the energy market, shifting political tides, have made it very difficult for Western nuclear vendors to survive. Now, in contrast, state-owned nuclear enterprises like Rosatom and China's are sponsored and subsidized by the state, which sees nuclear deals as part of government-to-government agreements rather than purely corporate contracts. And I'll talk a little bit more about how Rosatom has gotten sort of moved forward so quickly in that regard. So Rosatom made it clear very early on its ambition to leverage its comparative strategic advantage in nuclear technology. As we all know, they have a long history of both of civilian nuclear technology and also just education, and they continued to emphasize this as the West stopped investing in sort of education in nuclear as well as sort of interesting in new designs. So Rosatom really announced the intention to continue its funding. The state was really behind Rosatom from very early on, even in the early 2000s. And as a result, they have continued to sort of pump in and generate new technology with the result that now they actually do have sort of best-in-class technology. Most of their new reactors are best-in-class. We'll talk about safety in a little bit later. But the West has not had the capital to invest in sort of the same design and improvements that Russia has over the past few years. But there are other players on the market, right? It's not just Russia. South Korea has several contracts, and of course, China has grand ambitions to sort of expand its scope in this arena. But at this point, Russia's sort of unrivaled for two reasons. One is it offers very attractive financing packages, which I'll get into in a minute. And two, it's kind of moved ahead of the West in terms of its ability to sell new types of reactors for very, very competitive prices. So just to give you a little overview of what Rosatom's activities are, it has 8 sort of new operating reactors in Ukraine, Iran, China, and India. And it's actually just in the past month or so has started the new phase of construction on new reactors in Iran. So they just poured the concrete at a new reactor deal in Iran. There's some other Iran news we can chat about later, maybe in this discussion, if we have time. They have, actually this is now 9 reactors under construction, 12 more contracted in China, Bangladesh, Turkey, Finland, Iran, Armenia. Many more ordered. The Egypt project has actually, since I did these slides a few months ago, has actually moved forward. And then a number of proposals that are either pending or on hold for various reasons. It looks, for example, like the Jordan deal, which Rosatom had been negotiating for many, many years, is now not going to go through. These projects take ages to negotiate because sort of these sorts of deals are commercial, but they require a very good relationship between the two states, because nuclear reactor deals are very long-term, right? They're over the lifetime of the reactor, which can be, roughly 100 years, and they require close cooperation, especially with states that don't have any previous nuclear experience. It requires a lot of interaction between the two states as they go on. And then sort of over the past 2 years, Rosatom has signed agreements with all of these countries. They're very initial, broad documents, similar to the U.S. 123 agreements, right, which are just like the basis to even have a negotiation process for opening talks in the future. It's unlikely, of course, that all of these projects will come to fruition because the downstream country might not be suitable, the financing might not be suitable, and Russia really takes on the bulk of the financing for many of these agreements. Okay, so how does Russia sell its nuclear power plant? And this is sort of the crux of my argument. It's something that has kind of been a little bit talked about in the popular media, but not really studied in the academic sphere yet. But the way that Russia uses its contractual models is really telling in terms of its goals. It was the same sort of situation in Gazprom's contracts. They were very extensive. They had a lot of different components and provisions that actually were very illustrative of sort of Russia's deeper foreign policy goals. And these contracts, the BOO contracts and also the turnkey model, are also very illustrative of what Russia is trying to achieve in each different states. So they use two main contractual models to sell their reactors. So Rosatom has used its project in Turkey, this is a rendering of the Turkish project, to test drive its build, own, operate model, BOO, where basically Rosatom handles the entire financing, construction, production, and operation chain. And this model is marketed towards states with no previous nuclear experience because Rosatom will handle the entire process and own and operate the plant for the entire lifetime of the reactor. So this has concerned some Western observers who note that it creates a near-perfect monopoly and places Russian workers and Russian valuable assets on foreign soil, which might even create sort of strategic interest for the Kremlin to maintain a physical troop presence in a state with which it has a BOO contract. And of course, this is the model that Kremlin is pushing on new potential partners throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. But in the Chinese case, actually, Rosatom exports Reactor under the so-called turnkey model, which is a much less extensive model in terms of participation and also in terms of potential security and foreign policy implications. So under this model, which requires a so-called intelligent consumer as a sort of partner, Russia will design the power plant, deliver equipment, materials, and construct and install basically the nuclear island and turbine, commission the power plant, and then train local personnel. The partner state sort of provides a hold-up and different host of things and non-safety related equipment, and the financing really varies under these contracts because under this model, Rosatom does not own the plant and generally does not provide its own workers beyond the training phase. So how does this play out in terms of some cases? Well, in June 2018, as I just said, Chinese and Russian nuclear executives signed the biggest package of contracts between the two states, overseeing a really just wide range of nuclear activities, cooperation on a fast reactor pilot project, the supply of technology for China's lunar exploration program even. And there's several reasons to dig into the contract to show why maybe we shouldn't be so alarmed by this development. So to accomplish China's goal, which is outlined in its energy development strategy, they want to increase nuclear capacity by over 50% in the next 20 years. And to accomplish this, China has invested in Russian technology, but has also drawn technology from France, Canada, and Westinghouse. And in the past 15 years or so, China has become largely self-sufficient in reactor design and construction, as well as other aspects of the fuel cycle. And so that's the reason why it's declared its intention to export nuclear technology, including heavy components in the supply chain. And actually now China is actually capable of fabricating water-to-water and energetic reactor fuel via technology transfer, and is entitled to do so for its Rosatom dying reactor at Tianwan. So Rosatom actually therefore faces significant competition in the Chinese market. Maybe not from other states, but from Chinese companies for sure. And so to do this, to sort of deal with this situation, Rosatom has to avoid sort of politicizing its actions or seeking increased concessions in other issue areas. So that's kind of similar to Power of Siberia. China is Russia's keystone consumer here, but Russia is not China's most important producer, right? And that's the key difference. Concerns about the use of Rosatom as a tool to ensure sort of Russian influence on the country over an extended period of time also maybe don't necessarily apply in the Chinese case, because unlike other consumers, China actually pays for the construction of the facilities itself. China is actually one of the only consumers that pays Rosatom outright, which makes it a crucial source of financing for the firm as it seeks to expand its reach into new, less profitable markets. So because China pays for the financing of its own reactors, Rosatom hands over the keys to the reactors once they're up and running. China has actually been really good. It's repaid its loans on time and actually early, which is really key for Russia as they give very attractive financing packages to other states. So, I kind of missed that one, sorry. Anyways, this is just a summary of the thing. So, is Rosatom the new Gazprom? This is actually a picture of Putin looking on at the CEO of Rosatom, and an official from Congo signed one of those initial sort of 1, 2, 3 agreements, and this is in May 2019. So, looking at the China deal, it's important to compare it to other deals, and one of the best ones to compare it with is Russia's actions in Turkey. So, this is actually that top picture there is Rosatom at Akuyu doing an announcement of sort of initial beginning of the digging at the Turkish plant there. So Russia's BOO contract, that's the build and operate contract with Turkey, is valued over $20 billion and has entirely different implications for the Russian firm and the state. So unlike Russia's activities in both India and China, both of which had previous nuclear experience, the Turkish state is reliant on Moscow for every aspect of the project, from financing, education, training, and even governance, right? So Turkey's not only an important project for Rosatom, but the Turkish state would likely not have been able to complete the project without Russian assistance. The project originated when Turkey put out a tender process in 2008 with a firm requirement that all vendors take back spent fuels. So 14 vendors submitted expressions of interest, but Russia was the only state willing to offer fuel take back, so Russia was the only bid. And after some initial kind of problems with the contract, Putin and Erdogan signed the contract for 4 reactors under a BOO model. So whereas China, and actually Iran even, financed Russian reactors through cash or oil barter, Russia financed its BOO plants in Turkey and some other places too, with 100% equity in the project company in return for a fixed price for 70% of the electricity produced for the first and second units, and 30% for the third and fourth units for 15 years. So in the long term, after the project has been repaid through electricity sales, Russian subsidiaries will retain 51% of the project company and then sell the remaining shares to a strategic investor. So given the huge capital costs of plant construction and changes to the electricity market, they're actually driving down the cost over the long term. The extent to which Rosatom will actually profit from this project is really debatable. What is clear, however, is that Rosatom will continue to be a major player in the Turkish industry for at least the next 60 years. Another kind of side note with this is that Rosatom is actually helping Turkey to write the legislation, the nuclear safety architecture and legislation that will then govern its own reactors. So the Turkish government has asked for Rosatom to consult with them to help kind of build this legislation, so they're working directly to draft Turkish law. So Akuyu, and then as well as Russia's other BOO project in Egypt, sort of reveal motivations for Russia beyond commercial viability, because both of these projects are just not really commercially viable. The Chinese projects absolutely were. They got paid back before the loans were even due. But a lot of Russia's new projects just don't make financial sense once you do cost breakdowns. So, for example, Rosatom's project in El Daba in Egypt, Rosatom is providing 85% of an estimated $12.5 billion construction costs, and it is very unlikely that the plant will be able to pay back given the conditions of the loan. Even other Rosatom projects that sort of fall between BOO and the Turkey model and the turnkey model indicate non-commercial motives, right? So Russia is financing $10 billion of a $12.5 billion loan for the nuclear power plant in Pax at Hungary. And of course, this sweetheart deal is sort of seen as a widely larger part of the overall patterns of just increased close ties between Putin and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Russia is continuing to finance the construction of a power plant in Belarus, which is already poor and completely reliant on Russian national gas and has basically never been able to pay back its energy loans. And several observers of the stalled deal in Jordan commented that Russia had worked hard to sort of secure the deal so they would have a foothold in the region, sort of regardless of the outcome of Syria. And even though those deals collapsed, they had sort of spent a long time working to make sure that they would be able to have good relations with the Jordanian government. So, should the West be concerned about Rosatom's role in the global energy market? Yes and no, right? So in recent years, Russia's actually had more or less relatively good safety record with its nuclear power, and historically was the architect, along with the United States, of the global nuclear safety guidelines. So as Western participation in foreign nuclear projects declines, so does its influence on the International Nuclear Safety Article. That said, Rosatom has demonstrated a commitment to upholding this architecture. And one implication of the boom model is that trained Russian workers will be in charge of nuclear power plants rather than workers in states who don't have previous nuclear experience. So that's maybe one net positive. Further, as China increases its activity in the nuclear power plant market, export market, U.S. and Russia do share a mutual interest in upholding non-proliferation, safety, and security architectures as sort of one of the main founders of this legislation. So it is possible, and I would recommend the United States and Russia should work together, that these sort of standards are upheld as the United States kind of recedes from this market. But sort of second, and maybe more pressing, is that it's sort of clear from a close examination of Rosatom's global activities that China and Russian nuclear cooperation is not evidence of a strategic alliance, right? So I've given sort of a version of this talk around DC over the past year, and I've been like nailed over the head by questions and being like, how can you say they're not in a strategic alliance? There's so much evidence. I'm like, well, there sure is cooperation along a host of issues, right? But if you look closely at the sort of content of some of that cooperation, I think that some people are kind of jumping to conclusions and not really looking at the overall picture. And this is one arena in which that is, along with Power of Siberia. So I saw so many op-eds this week sort of talking about how Power of Siberia is like the death knell for the U.S. and is like the cornerstone of this new relationship. It's just not true, right? There's been a lot of disappointments on the Russian side for Power of Siberia. And the nuclear side of that component just doesn't really fit that story either. But it is evidence that Russia is really, of course, benefiting largely from the fact that the U.S. and China interests are not converging, especially in Asia, right? This means that both Russia and China's interests, especially in energy, are very complementary. Russia has resources that China needs, and China has capital that Russia needs. Finally, sort of Russia's nuclear engagement in other areas, like Turkey and Hungary and even India, provide preliminary evidence for the notion that Russia is using its nuclear exports as strategic economic statecraft, because the economics of these deals just don't make sense. Both Russia and China are engaged in large-scale economic statecraft around the world, and China's efforts in this regard get a ton of attention, right? We all know about BRI. We all know about China's economic activities everywhere. But Russia's economic statecraft efforts have been largely ignored sort of outside Europe, I would say. And I think that's a big mistake, because Russia is spending a lot of money and time in increased economic engagement in other parts of the world. And this is one example of how they can do that. These efforts have been really particularly successful, especially in this region and in this topic, because the West has not offered a competitive and credible alternative. In the coming years, sort of observing the kind of fine details of Russia's nuclear exports, as well as its just larger plans of economic statecraft, I think is going to be increasingly crucial. So thanks for your time, and I'm